Hi everyone, welcome back to the Stitches and Scribbles channel. My name is Erin and I have a themed podcast episode for you guys today. I decided to choose this episode just because of some of the current projects I have going and also some plans that I have for this year in terms of projects. So today we're going to be talking about scrap management, and what that kind of entails is some scrappy projects that I'm going to be talking about, some ways that I store my scraps, how I sort my scraps, how I decide what to keep and what to toss, all that stuff. So we'll dive into that. I know that using scraps or organizing scraps is something high on a lot of people's lists in terms of organizing their craft space or using yarn that they've purchased in an effective way. So hopefully this will give you a couple of ideas on how to keep everything neat and tidy and useful. So first of all, I separate my scraps into a couple of different categories that I'll show you or talk about before I show you. First category is all of my worsted weight acrylic goes in one bucket. And while I don't use a lot of worsted weight acrylic for personal use anymore, it is something that I use frequently for craft fair items, whether it's knitting machine hats and scarves or little plushies or things like that. Worsted weight acrylic tends to be what I go through for that type of project. It's also the type of yarn that I most frequently gifted or use for bigger items such as blankets or shawls. It's commonly used for prayer shawls as well. So I have a bucket where I keep all, or it's actually a drawer that goes in my laundry room, but it comes out, which is why I keep calling it a bucket, so it looks like a little plastic bin. I keep all of those scraps together, and that tends to be the bucket I go into to make little amigurumis or kind of try new techniques. If I just need like scrap yarn to work with, that's usually where I go. So that is probably my biggest collection of scraps at this moment. My second type of scraps that is also in a bin that we won't see today because I'm not currently working on a project and it's in the other room are all of my cotton scraps. So cotton worsted weight yarn is another common one that I use for craft fairs. So I do have a bucket of all of the cotton scraps as well. And while I don't have a project for those going at the moment, I am planning on making a bunch of scrappy washcloths for use within my home or for anybody in my life who wants one, just because I have a lot of random colors left and I figured they don't need to go to waste and can be used for something functional since the colors would get a little wacky for something decorative. So cotton worsted weight yarn is the other category of scraps. I have two more scrap categories that I'm currently working on. One of them, and I'm gesturing because it's in here, one of them is all of my sock wool leftovers, whether I actually use them for socks or for other things. It's all the sock weight yarn, it's all wool or like wool blends, and I've been keeping it in here until I start my actual project with them. And then my other current scrap bin is DK acrylic scraps. So, what am I doing with all of these? Let's talk about my sock weight scraps first. So, I, for a long time, have been really interested in doing a yarn advent calendar. However, yarn advent calendars are really expensive, as they should be. They're made with hand-dyed yarn. They're beautifully packaged and put together. It's just not something that is personally in my budget at the moment. So I decided that I would make my own yarn advent calendar and hold on to all of my sock weight scraps throughout the year and put them into an old advent calendar so that I could still have something to open every day during December. Because of that, I am sorting all of my sock weight scraps into little scrap balls of yarn and putting them inside of this tin for now. So there are a couple of things in here that probably won't make it into my actual advent calendar, like sparkly yarn. I think this is the only sparkle one I have, so I'll have to use it for something else. But in general, if it's sock weight, it's going in here. Now, kind of an offshoot of that category, I have been working with a lot of self-striping yarn lately. And what I've discovered is when it comes to scraps for self-striping yarn, I have found I'm more likely to use it if I split the yarn into its base colors instead of keeping it in the self-striping setup. So I actually have some scrap balls here on the table that were from a self-striping yarn that have now been split into their base colors. So I have an orange, a green, a like yellowish cream, a light blue, a dark blue, and a pink, and there should be a purple somewhere. It might have rolled away. And that's another way that I kind of manage my scraps from that type of yarn, because the goal for keeping the scraps is to eventually use it. And if I'm not going to use it when it's in its self-striping form, then I might as well put it into a form where I am going to use it. These are not going in my container for right now because I am still working on a project with that yarn, so I know I'm going to have more scraps in those colors. On to the next project. So this yarn you might recognize from my Taylor Swift cardigan. I also have yarn in here from my Valentine's Day cardigan, this dark burgundy, and I have a gray DK weight. I have no idea what this was from. Maybe a baby blanket? Unsure. I am saving all of these scraps with the idea that I will make a sweater at some point. And the reason for that is because I have 2 more sweater quantities of DK weight acrylic yarn that are in my stash that I know I want to get to this year. And those are in kind of a sage green and a caramely brown. So my idea is that once I have all of the scraps, I want to make a Christmas sweater with them, because I'll have the burgundy and the green and a palette of neutrals to choose from. And I'm hoping that I can do something with like some color work in the yoke, kind of the Scandinavian style Christmas sweater. And hopefully I will only need to purchase, if anything, a base color for the rest of the sweater. So maybe a deep green or a darker charcoal gray, or even like a deep brown or a bright Christmassy red would all be good with that color palette. So if you tend to use the same type of yarn frequently for a bunch of projects, save your scraps and maybe use them to test out a color work pattern or make something a little bit more whimsical that you can add to your wardrobe that's still going to match with things you already have, because those colors are already in your wardrobe. So I tend to wear a lot of cardigans and sweaters, which is why I bought all of that yarn to begin with. But by saving the scraps, I can give myself kind of a bonus sweater that's already going to fit in with my wardrobe color scheme. On to my worsted weight acrylic scrap mess. So this is the category of yarn that has the most random colors. It has the most chaos. So I figured if I'm going to do a scrappy project with this type of yarn, it needs to be something where I truly don't care what the final version of it looks like. And because of that, I decided to do a scrappy blanket. And I have attempted scrappy blankets in the past. Some of them I've liked how they looked, some of them I haven't. I distinctly remember I had one that lasted for most of college, but it eventually got holes in it because of how much I used it and because of the quality of yarn I had chosen. That was a bunch of random sized granny squares, like patched and stitched together, but I didn't sew it very well, so it didn't last very long. So I wanted, in my scrap blanket, because it is a blanket, for this round, I wanted to make sure that I had something that I didn't have to do any sewing at the end in order for it to be finished. And I wanted something that would have blocks of color, because I don't like it when scrap blankets are in like long stripes, so you don't get to like see each color stand out on its own. So I knew I wanted something that would have like tiny blocks of color instead of like long rows of scrap colors. And because of that, I decided to do the 10 stitch blanket, which is a pattern on Ravelry from what I understand. I found a free tutorial for how to do it on YouTube, and that's what I have been working off of. So I started with this pink in the center, moved to the lilac, then this gold color, then turquoise, this like deep maroon burgundy, and then this peachy color is where I'm currently working, and I have it attached to a scrap ball. In this bin, however, I do have some scraps that are not really scraps. They're pretty substantial in size. Like I have this ball of pink acrylic that I don't know what I was using it for, but I have quite a bit left over. I have this green one that's pretty substantial. I have quite a bit of black that's all slightly different. So for the colors that are a little bit bigger, I'm gonna let them sit in the scrap bin for a while and see if I can't find a use for them before I incorporate them into the blanket, because I want the blanket to be mostly these small little scraps so that my pieces are fairly even in size. I don't expect them to all be like exactly equal, but I don't want like a huge panel of one color that like makes it all the way around as a stripe and then like little tiny blocks of everything else. So for those bigger quantities of scraps, I'm going to let them simmer for a bit to see if I use them on something else first. And those are all the scrap categories I currently have at the moment, which kind of leads to the next category of what about everything else? So if there's a yarn that I genuinely don't think I will use the scraps of, if there's a significant amount of it left, like more than 200 yards, enough for a mini skein, I will cake it up or ball it up and put it in a donation box with the idea to eventually take it to Goodwill or a local thrift store to be sold. Or if it's something like acrylic that has like not enough left to do anything with, but too much left to just throw away, I actually add it to my bag of stuffing to use for filling little stuffed animals and other stuffed objects. So that's a great way to use scraps too. If it's something really funky that I genuinely don't think anyone's going to use, if it's like damaged in some way, then I don't feel bad about just tossing it. I have definitely gotten some yarns in the past that were like thrifted or gifted to me from somebody's stash that had been sitting for a while. So if you find yarn that is genuinely kind of icky and not fun to work with, don't feel bad about purging it from your stash. Even if you're not making it available for anybody else to use. Sometimes you do just have to get rid of it. But I'm excited for all of these scrappy projects. I'm really excited to have a DIY advent calendar. I think that's going to be a good way to use my sock scraps and have it be kind of like a memories project. And hopefully I'll end up with another big blanket for my basement that I can just kind of continue working on over time, which led me to another point that I meant to make earlier, but since I remembered it now, I'll go ahead and add it here. If you have long-term scrap projects that you're working with, especially things like blankets that are really big, pick tools that you don't mind having not available to you for a while. This doesn't matter as much with crochet hooks because it's pretty easy to pull a crochet hook out of a project and just put it back later. But for knitting needles, use your old knitting needles that you don't really care about for projects like this, because you don't want to have it stuck in a long-term scrap project and then realize you need it for something else. You could also go to thrift stores to get an old crochet hook or an old pair of needles that you can use for your scrap projects so that you're not using your nice tools in something that's going to sit for a while. I think that was the last point I was going to make in this episode. I hope you enjoyed this random tangent and that it gave you some ideas for scraps that you have, how to keep them separate. Generally sorting them by weight makes a huge difference for me because I know exactly what I'm looking for. It also means that I know if everything's in the same bucket, I can use it all on the same project, which is really nice. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more crafty content from me here on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below so that you can be notified of all of my crafty content right here. And if you'd like to follow me on other forms of social media, that information will be in the description box below. Thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye everyone!